All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So today we're going to talk about optimization systems models. So last time I gave kind of an overview of a bunch of different sort of top-down and bottom-up models. And today we're going to focus specifically on optimization systems models. These are very common kind of in this area. And so yeah, we're doing a little bit of deeper dive here because hopefully this will be useful for anyone who's interested in looking at these types of systems models. So kind of to provide a little bit more motivation, so why are we thinking specifically about optimization, and why does it show up so often in these sort of systems models? So when we think about the types of outcomes that we're interested in looking at, with energy systems, that often involves many coupled decisions, right? And so if I wanted to decrease emissions or reduce sort of energy intensity in kind of broad society, right, there are many, many different levers to do this, right? I could switch from a natural gas plant to a solar farm. I could get people to drive less, right? I could make people eat less meat and become vegetarians, right? And so there's all these different decisions that could be made, and where you have some local intuition about like, oh, is it specifically cost efficient to like switch from a natural gas to coal, or like, what would it take to get a particular individual to become a vegetarian, right? That kind of intuition starts to fall apart at a large system scale. So optimization specifically is a way to kind of put that all into the same playing field, so that you can make a quantitatively rational decision about how to make trade-offs. Okay, so really the reason why a lot of these large system models lean on optimization is specifically for this reason, and that it helps build intuition for why lots of decision making occurs. Okay, and so one thing I kind of want to motivate you guys to think about is like what are you actually doing in the optimization, right? What question are we kind of really asking? And one of the pieces of that is thinking carefully about like who the optimization actually pertains to, right? And so if I were to generically say something about like, let's try and reduce energy consumption in our system, like who would be the person making that decision? What do you guys think? Any ideas? Right, so there's a lot of stakeholders to think about, right? So maybe the government, maybe it's corporations, maybe it's kind of people in general, right? So the design of the optimization can be focused on a particular entity or individual, but oftentimes we're thinking about society as a whole. And so most of these system models are not looking at these particular entities. Instead, you kind of imagine that there is a sort of benevolent social planner, right? And so a lot of these optimizations which focus on costs is like, imagine that there's some kind of dictator, king, benevolent person who just cares about, let's say, minimizing the cost. So optimizations are often from the viewpoint of like society as a whole, with like a central planner that you're empowering to make the decisions that the optimization is undergoing. Okay, and what question are we really asking? This will tie also into the scoping of your optimization. So very commonly, the things that might be included in your optimization are things like different technologies, the costs related to these technologies or other sort of changes in the system, demands of how much energy or resource or service is needed, um, and oftentimes these models will be sheltered a little bit to some extent from exposure to things like politics or behavior or firm strategy. Although I will say that there certainly are examples of optimizations that actually do partake in trying to replicate, things like behavior and firm strategy. You might have these like equilibrium type conditions that you could bake into the optimization. Those tend to be a little bit more complex. Oftentimes, those type of models take you from more like linear or mixed integer optimizations more into like non-convex territory. Like if you're trying to include like a discrete choice model to represent some kind of behavior, or if you're doing like some kind of like equilibrium, like Bertrand equilibrium to represent how like different people are competing with each other. It is possible to include those, but those would be probably a little bit less common, and they will make the actual system quite a bit more complex. Okay, any questions about any of this so far? Yeah.
Are the questions going to get turned into parameters, constraints, like all these questions, or it's just an overall picture?
We're like moving towards that. Yeah, yeah. So I'm gonna do a little bit of a like toy example, and then we'll actually do like an in-class exercise, and you guys can think of some of those things. So quick sort of caveat. So last time I talked about simulations as well as other types of models that are commonly done in this domain, and I wanted to maybe help distinguish the sort of difference between what we traditionally call simulation versus what's traditionally called an optimization. So simulation is thinking about if I build X, kind of what happens. So you are evaluating decisions. So to run a simulation, you make a series of assumptions to build this model, and you kind of see what outcomes come out of those decisions that are baked into the assumptions that you're making. Whereas an optimization is more, what should I build? And so here you are selecting the decisions based on sort of the structure of your model as opposed to assuming particular decisions are being made. Okay, so slight distinction there between these two types of approaches. And really, the value of each kind of depends on what you're trying to do. So let's talk about the anatomy of system optimization. So here, you could be exposed to many different systems levels models that have very different structures that were sort of built up over time by, some group of researchers at a university or a lab. And so they all have kind of unique twists on it in the design of the kind of whole system and the scope of what they're considering. But kind of at the end of the day, any system optimization will break down into the fundamental components of an optimization that we covered during our optimization lecture. Okay, and so these are the things that you were asking about, right? So in an optimization system, we have our objective function, which tells us the thing that we actually want to minimize or maximize, right? The decision variables, which are the variables that you change in order to achieve that objective, and then constraints, which put limits on the way often that decision variables are allowed to be, essentially. from a practical perspective, in addition to these things, which help you provide the formulation of your optimization, you also have exogenous inputs, right? And so your inputs are going to be defining all of the parameters that exist in your optimization system. So basically, if you write out the math for your optimization system, anything that's not a decision variable is probably a parameter that needs to be defined by an exogenous input. And then you have your outputs. And the outputs are basically just your decision variables, what level the decision variables need to be in order to have minimized or maximized your objective function according to this entire system, right? And so exogenous inputs, defining parameters, outputs as the final level of your decision variables. I should also maybe mention that, yeah, it's not necessarily just the levels. There's you could look at the sort of marginal value. So people often talk about like shadow prices and like electricity systems. So there is a little bit beyond just outputs being the level of the decision variables, but for the most part, that's mainly what you're going to be focusing on. Okay, and then consideration in your system about what's exogenous versus what's endogenous. So think carefully about these things to prevent like category errors later. So for example, things that we might have as exogenous, and so these things would be defined as the parameters, would be like the demand, fuel prices, technology cost, and then the things that are endogenous would be essentially your decision variables or things that are calculated as related to an outcome of the decision variable. So things like capacity, activity, fuel use, emissions, those could in theory be like the endogenous pieces to your system. But they don't have to be, right? And so one of the things that you ought to make sure that is kind of straight in your mind is that sort of difference between the exogenous and endogenous. And so in this particular example, maybe I'll ask you guys like what would actually break if the demand were endogenous here. So if I treated demand as a decision variable as opposed to an external parameter input. Yeah.
For example, if I would want to minimize cost, for example, then I could just put the demand to zero, then I don't
Yeah.
have to produce it.
Perfect. Exactly. And so without the demand being set as an exogenous value, if it's endogenous as a decision variable, I'll just set demand equal to 0. So then I don't need any activity, I don't need any fuel use, I've minimized my emissions, I don't need any capacity to produce stuff to fulfill demand since it's just 0, right? And so you do want to make sure to keep straight this idea of like what things are actually changing in the model versus things that you want to keep fixed. Okay. One other sort of major consideration are sort of time scales, right? And so why time matters. So, I have the slides backwards. That's right. Okay, so here, maybe at the beginning I decide to invest in wind, and because of that, later on I have to build sort of long distance high voltage DC lines to get the power from where the wind is generated to population centers. Because I have wind, maybe I'm kind of coupling with carbon capture, natural gas to handle intermittency. Maybe I have so much excess, eventually I'll decide to build like hydrogen infrastructure, right, to try and take advantage of wind energy that might be wasted. Alternatively, maybe I invest instead in a bunch of solar, right? And because of that, I need to build out a bunch of storage to handle the intermittency. maybe this leads to more distributed microgrids, and then a lot more DC equipment. And then maybe you want to have some flexibility programs to help reduce curtailments, deal with the solar intermittency. Okay, this is totally made up example, right? But the idea is down the line, when you make a decision kind of in the present, it may have sort of large effects sort of down into the future. And so we care about things like the persistence of capital. Decisions today may constrain things that happened later on. And then, depending on the way that capital happens, how the capital values kind of are valued over time, right? That's the discounting that can shape a lot of the outcomes for investment decisions. And so all of this kind of just speaks to an extra dynamic that is very common in these system models to consider. And then the last thing that I'll maybe mention as things to pay attention to, or things to keep in consideration, right? Policy is very commonly used as a lever to affect your system, because we're interested in the effects of policy and what kind of outcomes can result from that. Okay, and so what are some common policies that I might, want to think about in an optimization system like this? Yeah.
Like any kind of policy that could change like your cost, for example.
Okay.
Rebates, for example.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So subsidies. Anything else? Any ideas? General policies that you would want to have to improve your energy system? Okay, one more. Taxes. Like what kind of taxes?
I mean, cost
Carbon tax. Yeah. So, okay, great. So maybe like a carbon tax, emissions cap, right? So the alternative to dealing with carbon emissions as an externality in California, we have a cap and trade, and so you might want to do something like that instead. Subsidies, you mentioned. Also, just straight up mandates, right? Requirements for certain entities to do certain things or to meet certain performance standards, right? And so all of these can be represented in different ways in an optimization, right? So with a carbon tax, maybe that's an additional cost term to include in your objective function. What about emissions cap? Yeah, how would you do that? Yeah, just a simple constraint. Subsidy, that would probably fall into the objective function as a negative cost. Mandate would be, a different type of constraint. Yeah, and so one of the nice things is that if you can envision a formulation for the policy, then it's pretty straightforward to actually include that into your optimization system. And yeah, you can investigate all sorts of things that folks are interested in, right? And you can, whether or not you think the results are realistic from an optimization system, you have a quantitative basis for justification for, any of these things that you throw into those models. Okay, so let's do a little example here. So I want to provide this example where we're essentially running a super small optimization, and we're just going to think about this sort of qualitatively without any specific numbers. Well, I need to meet electricity demand over 2 periods of time, so time 1 and time 2. Okay, and then we're going to have 2 technologies that must meet a fixed demand. Okay, and so the characteristics of these technologies is here. So maybe we have some coal power, so low capital cost, high fuel cost, high emissions, long lifetime, compared to solar, where you might have a high capital cost, 0 fuel cost, 0 emissions, and a long lifetime. So the question is, given kind of what you see here, and I need to meet some electricity demand at lowest cost, what would the model build in the first period? What do you guys think? Can talk it out.
I guess it depends on the fuel cost.
Yeah, right. And so,
And the capital cost.
right. So, what are the things that you're considering if we're just thinking specifically about cost here? Yes.
Just the fuel and the capital.
Yeah. So it's really a comparison of like, okay, solar has high capital costs and zero fuel cost. Coal has low capital costs and high fuel cost. Which one of those over the course of that time period is higher, right? And whichever one is lower, I'm going to end up building because I'm trying to minimize costs, right? Now, what if there's a CO2 cap in period 2, right? So specifically, let's say your legislature or some regulatory agency decides, okay, we're going to implement the CO2 cap. So what changes? So in the second period, I am looking at my high cost, low cost thing about this trade-off between high capital cost versus low capital cost with high fuel cost. But I also have to consider this emissions cap. And if the coal is above that, then I really have no choice, right? Then I just have to build solar because you're under this constraint. I just simply wouldn't be allowed to build coal. Any questions about this? Does this make sense so far? So we can think about a more sort of formal representation of this little mini problem in an optimization structure. And so let me walk through this, looking specifically at these 3 components that I was talking about earlier, right? So anatomy of any system optimization, we want to think about objective function, constraints, and decision variables. And so our decision variables here, so what technology are we investing in? So the first term, INV, is telling us basically how much to build for, a particular technology. And then the second term is the installed capacity of that investment. And then the third term is the amount of generation. Okay, then we have our objective function, where here we are trying to minimize costs. And we are doing some discounting up front. And we are doing essentially the sum of how much, for each term, how much it costs to build it out, and then how much it costs to run it, right? And so there's a cost associated with the investment of the capacity, and there's some costs associated with the fuel cost for generating electricity, and we just add that up, and you try and minimize that. So there are a couple of decision variables that show up there, right? So INV and gen. So what are the other elements of this objective function? So we have an R, we have the C INV and C fuel. So who can tell me what those are, since we haven't defined them? Yes.
R the discount rate.
Yeah, so R is the discount rate, yep. And then the other 2 are costs. But these aren't decision variables, which would make them any ideas?
Your exogenous inputs.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So if you guys remember, right, in this slide, anything that's not a decision variable is an exogenous input. So we call these, so these are parameters that are essentially defined by your assumptions, your input values. And so in order to run this optimization, we need to define what R and CINV and C fuel are. And that would be the inputs. Exactly. Okay, and so what constraints do we have? We have this, the primary one, which is that you have to fulfill some amount of demand, so the electricity balance. So if you sum up all of the generation, that has to equal the demand. You have some capacity constraint. Gen IT is less than or equal to capacity. And then you have capital stock, which is keeping track of how much capacity you have in one period versus the next. So that you can't say, oh, I have some amount now, and then in the future, it doesn't just like go away, right? And then we have some emissions cap, right, in our period 2 that we were talking about. And so if you set time equals 2, whatever you're generating has maybe some emissions rate associated with it. So EI is by each technology I. So you have an emissions rate for coal, you have an emissions rate for solar, it'll just be 0 for solar, so that term will be 0. But if it's for coal, it'll be some larger term multiplied by how much generation is happening, and then that has to be under your cap. Okay? So this this formalization of the optimization, all of this is derived essentially from here. We are transforming, right, kind of our English interpretation into math here. So when we walk through what actually happens in period 1 without an emissions constraint, it's coal is cheaper to build. You're more likely to build coal. We haven't put any numbers to this, right? We're just kind of intuiting our way through. The reason why I may intuit this is, what do you think you would spend more money on? The capital cost of infrastructure or the fuel cost associated with that infrastructure for a year? Yeah.
Well, for a year, the capital cost, and probably in this short time period, the capital cost, but if it's a longer.
Yeah. So oftentimes that's going to dominate, right? So like, that's true for a coal plant. That could be true for many other things as well, like a car, for example. Like you're going to spend a lot more money buying the car than you would on spending the fuel for that car in at least the first year. Well, likely over the whole lifetime, but yes. So the intuition is more likely that you're going to build coal in period 1. Period 2, your emission cap binds, and then solar becomes necessary. But you've already built out that coal system, and so that's going to persist even if you choose not to operate it in that second year. Or you'll operate it less because of this cap constraint. Okay, any questions or thoughts? Yeah, so there is some also consideration about the sort of the timing of this. So should the planner just build the solar early in period 1 to avoid stranding that cost in period 2? That in theory could reduce the sort of total cost of your system. And that's going to pertain to the way that you've set up your optimization if you're only looking at 1 year at a time, or if you have what's known as like perfect foresight, where you can consider all the time periods simultaneously. That can lead to different outcomes happening, right? So if I didn't have this insight that the emissions cap would be getting put into place in period 2, then I may default to building the coal plant. But if I am able to see that, then I may actually choose to invest in like a more expensive, low emitting technology upfront. Okay. Any?
It doesn't take into effect, like, account any risk though of like
Mm-hmm.
the generation, like, I know you're talking about perfect conditions of being the forecast, but like even solar has like a risk associated with it fulfilling that full time, so is that not accounted for at all in this?
So, in this particular way that we've structured it, no, but you could, right? So, as you describe these things, we are thinking about like additional layers of complexity that can get added, of which risk could be one of those things. And so, there are different ways of doing this. You could do this in like a more dynamic process type of optimization. You could do this like you could represent the risk by running the optimization sort of many times under different conditions and seeing what the like distribution of outputs look like. So you'd essentially be doing like a Monte Carlo of the optimization. For this particular problem, probably wouldn't be too big of a lift, even though you're running an optimization many, many times. But if your optimization starts to get a little bit more complex, it might be harder to do something like that. But yes, some of the times the ways that people deal with it are like what I was just describing. But when they get more complex, you could use bounding scenarios. So, like, what if the solar really underproduced? Or what if it really overproduced? And you could run these scenarios to see then what your decision making process would look like.
And at no point you would consider any of like the emissions of producing the solar panels or installing them or having to maintenance them in this as well?
Well, that's all would be the scoping of this, right? And so where do you want to include that stuff? That stuff could be pretty easily included if you wanted to, right? So instead of saying that there's emissions associated with the generation, maybe you actually have some emissions associated with the initial capacity or investment, right? And that could represent like the upstream stuff, and that could get added here to be below the cap. Yeah. So you would essentially
And
say
the scale's super granular if you wanted.
yeah. So you could say plus let's say big E I, where big E it represents the fixed emissions associated with that, or big E times your investment, right? Which would scale based on the size of that generation system, as opposed to scaling with the amount that it's generating. Yeah, so that would be pretty straightforward to add. Yeah. Did you have a no? Okay. Okay, so yeah, strengths and weaknesses of your optimization system model. So we'll have really good at doing these trade-offs, as I was mentioning at the beginning of class. That's kind of one of the reasons we lean on these types of models. Technology substitution, you're able to put lots of different things for consideration in an optimization, right? In this setup that we have here, we're mainly talking about coal and solar, but without changing anything about the structure of this optimization, I could add in 50 more technologies without doing anything except changing the I, right? So you would need more input data and that sort of thing. But this optimization structure wouldn't actually need to change to accommodate more technologies. Policy comparisons, we're talking about that as a big benefit of these optimization systems. You can, if you're able to formulate them as part of the objective function or as a new constraint, you're able to see what happens as you implement these policies. And typically will do decently well with these sort of long run structures. You can run them for many years. Consumer behavior, integrating some of this stuff can be difficult. I have done it before, but oftentimes you're wandering into pretty non-linear territory, which makes the computation of the models a lot harder to solve. Innovation surprises, and so if there's something pretty revolutionary that comes out that you just didn't really have any information on, these aren't really going to be able to like accommodate that very well. Distributional outcomes, that depends kind of on the structure of your optimization, but generally we think about this from the perspective of society as a whole, right? And so yeah, the distribution of welfare and the sort of benefits that you derive out of your optimization are not always being treated in a way that cares about this stuff. I will say it doesn't mean you can't, right? You can like weight your objective function in ways that would put value into doing this, but you're essentially having to jump through some hoops to be able to represent different distributional outcomes. And then politics, yeah, I mean, that's a important piece of consideration for, you know, these larger systems models that in reality they're not totally independent from the political process, but you don't often see that being, you don't often see people trying to capture that in these types of models. Okay, questions? No. All right, so we're gonna do a little class activity now. So maybe break up into like groups of like 3 or 4. And yeah, you guys are essentially tasked with building a national electricity decarbonization model. And obviously I'm not going to ask you to, you know, build this out totally formally. But to start with, why don't we divide up and then think about defining an objective function to achieve this particular outcome. So what is it that actually needs to be minimized? And what costs are you kind of including and over what sort of time horizon? And so what I'll say is there isn't like one right answer. And in fact, yeah, hopefully you guys will come up with slightly different ways to view and you know, solve this.
Who are we doing this for, since politics do matter? Because that would influence the approach.
I mean,
Displaying the data, I guess, or displaying how.
Well, maybe that's a little more of a philosophical question. I mean, the idea that you know, if someone wants to design some kind of strategy for these things, maybe your foundation, maybe ultimately you want to include caveats about politics, but the foundation should be built off of stuff like this, where we are able to provide like a quantitative reasoning for why you're doing certain activities, right? The politics part might help modify this stuff, but that doesn't mean like outcomes from optimizations and these larger system models have helped informed lots of policies in the past. Yeah. I mean, you're saying maybe, but that's like for sure very true. Like I can tell you there are bills that I have worked on at the state and national level that have been heavily influenced by outcomes of models that we've run, right? And so, you know, is the baseline like the output of this model or some random staff intern who's just making numbers up, right? Like probably you would want some quantitative reasoning for some of this stuff, right? Like I can tell you the Inflation Reduction Act drew very heavily on a set of energy systems models that were coming out of like Princeton and 2 other national labs. And like, yes, some modifications were made for like EV battery requirements that had to do with politicking and Joe Manchin wanting, you know, domestic onshore manufacturing requirements, but like the numbers behind that were directly out of energy systems models that were run. So, yeah. Politics can change some of this stuff, but I think foundation coming from this is important. Okay. Talk.
Can you go back to the statement? Or
Yes, yeah, sure.
Yeah, well, I would say overall we would probably want to minimize cost while staying under a certain emissions cap each year. So you have like an emissions constraint, like that's the maximum you can have. And then you can minimize cost. While you meet the demand too.
I think like it's harder to. Cost, even though the emissions might be higher in the beginning. You know what I mean? Like if you're trying to set something up longer term, look at it longer perspective. So,
Yeah.
trying to shift like, I don't know, that was my kind of thing.
I mean, one of probably the SAS like the capitalization model is 2050, so I would guess. I mean, I guess like that depends on the like. Do you just want, does it only matter that in 2050 you're at zero, or do you have like a failure rate? But like if I would assume that like maybe for each year like policymakers have like a reasonable emissions cap, and like then would minimize costs basically to meet that. It's still pretty
Yes, definitely not, no, but,
So we get rid of the
it, having unified plan of terms is, I don't know, I'm thinking about it too abstract. Okay. So the total discounted like system cost is like what we're trying to minimize.
Basically, yeah. And then, yeah, and like full life, like as you mentioned earlier, not just like the burning the fuel, but also like building and everything. So full life cycle like because you have to generate, transmit, and distribute electricity, and also like full emissions, obviously. Full life cycle emissions.
Right, but we would wanna also have
And
like.
you could also minimize like
Because there has to be investment in future technology, or like, so getting to this point where like,
Yeah.
2050, so like, it can't just be about.
Well, and building all the facilities, like everything, like building like your generation plus your transmission distribution, and then also like burning the fuel or whatever used.
Right.
So basically like full life cycle of cost and emissions. Any other cost? I mean, technically, well, I would wonder, like, this is for, yeah, you could technically, like, the question is, do you, like, do you just want to meet like, if we say, assume we have an emissions cap each year, like, do you care, like, to just meet that, or, like, do you, like, because otherwise you can also include, like, social cost of carbon, like, if you're like, oh, maybe it's even better if you're below that cap, and minimizes, like, the total cost.
What if we have like a multi-year
Carbon, so more like avoid healthcare costs and all these other questions.
I'm trying to think of a social goal like this, social housing project like current saying that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it has but yeah, I'm not saying you need to. You could like you can technically just say let's just meet the cap and you don't care. You just care about like the actual like cost. You could do either one.
All right, let's do a quick debrief. Okay, so I wanna talk to each of you guys and see what you guys are thinking. So maybe if you guys want to go first, and yeah, just tell me about what you thought about sort of minimizing, and yeah, what sort of costs were you considering, what time horizon, Anyone?
I guess we also talked about the first one since we
Okay, sure.
didn't have this slide, so we kind of forgot to say it.
That's all right.
But also, I mean, like time horizon, I guess this plays into what could be minimized. We had a couple different options.
Okay.
One was even though it was for 2050, you could be minimizing for time because if you get it done in like by 2040, decarbonization, then that's advantageous. So
Okay.
minimize
How might you represent that?
I mean, I don't know exactly how it would be done, but I guess one thing to consider is if you have like similar to your capital costs and your fuel costs, you have like time till production for a generation facility.
Uh-huh.
And that variable might end up being minimized. So if it takes, 2 years to get to production for a utility scale solar plant and it takes 10 years for wind, then that model would select for solar.
Okay, yes, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I'm kind of thinking about this on the spot as well, but if you were minimizing emissions, for example, there's actually a pretty nice built-in mechanism that we talked about a lot that could help you value things happening sooner rather than later, right? Which is just discount rates. And so actually, if you discounted emissions every year, then you would actually put a lot more value on things happening sooner rather than later. So we get to turn the tables on people who discount like cost of technologies for mitigation. You discount emissions, that would do, I think, something similar. But okay. Anything else you guys want to mention? Okay, how about you guys? Oh, wait, sorry. No? Okay.
I guess we'll just mention a couple others. We did think about line losses, like minimizing line losses. We also talked about cost, but we were trying to come up with things that weren't just cost.
Yeah, sure.
So we also considered like a mineral budget, like minerals used, and deciding maybe potentially which minerals you're trying to minimize usage of.
Okay.
And then you could do similar things for like land area required, etc.
Yeah.
I just would want to add, like, if you use like emissions as your optimization, like objective, then you probably have to add like a cost constraint though, because otherwise your cost could just explode. Because like you can technically, if you want to, like reduce emissions, probably now if you have like.
Yeah, exactly.
Like
So
infinite amounts of money, but.
So that's an important point, right? And so even just the fundamental idea of like what's being minimized is pretty important, because if we think about like, can I reduce emissions to zero? Yeah, I could like kill everybody. That would reduce emissions. I could ban driving and ban electricity.
Like, he's the one still alive.
Yeah, but like you could get rid of no more electricity, no more cars, no more anything that emits, right? So no, you only raw food only, right? No cooking anything, right? So that would minimize emissions at sort of tremendous cost to society, right? And so yeah, it is important to think about those trade-offs, right? And so we talked about optimization being such a powerful tool to let us do trade-offs, but if you are not careful about what's being traded off, you could run into these situations where you'd be making trade-offs that you probably don't want to be making. Yeah.
Just a question of like how interchangeable then are some of the like constraint formulations versus the minimum, like the objective function minimization? Because like in this scenario, you could either have like a minerals budget and then you minimize cost.
Yeah.
Or you could you could have a cost constraint and then you like minimize minerals, for example.
Yeah.
And like so like how interchangeable are
I mean, a lot of times they can be fairly interchangeable. I think the what is it? Like the advice that I would give about this is like the thing that don't make it too artificial. Like the thing that you actually want to minimize is the thing that you should be minimizing, and then the thing that you constrain should be sort of byproduct of that. And so yes, so for the example that you're giving, you know, do we want to get rid of minerals, but are constrained to not be able to do so, or do we want to? And so when I say get rid of, that's like you're saying you're minimizing, right? Versus, are we trying to make things like cost efficient, but we are constrained by having to, you know, have some amount of minerals or something like that, right? And so a lot of times you can get equivalent answers, and I think the philosophy is more based on what you think should be minimized. Yeah.
Well, I think in this context, for example, my thought was to minimize cost while staying below a certain emissions cap each year, for example, and in the end it might be 0 in 2050. And I think in comparison to that, like the version where you have minimize emissions under like a budget, for example, like a money or minerals budget or whatever, there you probably have lower emissions overall in the end, but it's more expensive because the budget you maybe thought of might be higher than the minimum cost you get in the other way. In the other
Yes.
would get you a lower cost, but probably a bit more emissions.
Yeah, exactly. So those are the types of trade-offs that you would want to think about when you're deciding between these. Okay, what about in the back? What do you guys talk about?
We looked at minimizing carbon emissions.
Okay.
For cost of matter, we talked about cost of fuel, capital, O&M, land, transmission, infrastructure, decommission, salvage, potentially carbon penalties or cap and trade mechanisms as well. What time horizons? 5 seem like a nice number. So 5, 10, 15, 2025.
Sure. Okay. Well, about the other two groups, you guys have anything?
I feel like we actually synthesized everyone's into ours. Like we've had minimized carbon emissions, like David.
Okay.
Fuel costs, technology costs, salvage value, O&M costs. So.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe we should have done this at the same time, but we have, okay, we'll do the next two pieces at the same time. So now I want you to think about at least 5 decision variables. Sounds like you guys maybe picked some of them already, but we want to include things that are both on the investment side and operational side. And then 5 constraints. So think about like a physics-based, a policy-based, and then maybe one for sort of accounting. And so this exercise is really to get you guys to think about all of the different types of things that you could include in your optimization. And if you're feeling bold, you can think about how that might get formulated. But yeah, just expressing these 2 sets of things. So take a couple minutes, we'll go again. Think specifically about what's a decision variable and how that would pertain to what you are minimizing, whether that's cost or emissions. And then what constraints are you going to put into your system? So an accounting identity would be something like how you might translate from like a fuel consumption to an energy amount, something like that.
Okay.
So for example, if you had an emissions cap, right, how would you translate like a generation into emissions, right? That would be the accounting piece that would get you from like one, there's a counting piece that needs to happen for you to do that translation.
Okay. And then the other side was what investment decision? clean power, right, you have to meet demand, otherwise, you know, the electricity grid goes out.
And for example, at like, if you have solar facilities, your production can't be more than the solar radiation at each time, times the efficiency.
Right, and it can't be used in very either of those demand, right?
Well, yeah, when it's dark, when there's no solar radiation, you can't have solar, yeah. Exactly.
But same with wind. Like if
That
you-
might be an accounting, so.
But it's also physics-based, is it not?
It might not be, right?
I would say it's physics-based because if there's no wind, you can physically not produce any electricity from your wind turbine.
Yeah, from higher.
But like maybe you also ramp up sometimes.
Because like when the accounting dynamics the fuel consumption that leads to energy, so like in this.
Well, I
accounting
guess it's-
variable would be the sunlight or the wind, like.
Yeah. But I guess if you want something else like the ramp up time, you have like a natural gas power plant and turning it on, and you can't just go from 0 to 100. Like you have to consider a ramp up. And then, but I think the decision variables we also didn't discuss it. So investment, for example, would be to build like certain kinds of generation, like build a solar plant or build a natural gas plant or build a nuclear plant.
Capacity to build each one of those.
Yeah, build the capacity, for example.
Yeah.
And then operating would be, using natural gas, your natural gas, but like burning fuel in a natural gas plant, or like charging a battery, discharging a battery.
Being able to use wind when it's available, when it's got things like
Yeah, I mean,
operational variable, I guess. You have to account for it.
Yeah. And then also charging and discharging a battery.
Dispatch.
Yeah, any dispatch system basically. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then policy.
Transmission.
Oh yeah, transmission limits, yeah.
Definitely investment, sure.
Oh yeah, building it, but also physics constrained, like you can't transmit more than like your transmission capacity is. Yeah, you can try.
Yeah, you can try to burn up those.
You can try, but you shouldn't. But yeah, so that's.
So engineering constraints like generator capacity.
Yeah, or ramp up time. Wait, we also have engineering? No, that's physics and policy. I mean, physics.
I was just thinking about like.
But engineering based and physics based is kind of the same. I mean, maybe not every physics constraint is an engineering constraint, but I would say every engineering constraint is automatically a physics constraint.
So you just covered the policy.
I'll agree with you there, okay. Semantics. But policy constraint would be just net zero by 2050
Yeah,
without
for
any
example.
other.
Yeah, for example, that emissions budget or like it's like a carbon tax, like a tax or something could be.
I guess like the constraint is so like for policy, it's what happens if they don't, what is their value, right? People aren't married. Yeah, you know, I don't know, I'm trying to figure out the constraint for policy.
Yeah,
like,
so there's several things that we come up with.
Isn't there like an inverse relationship to that too? Cause like we don't need it.
Well, if you don't, then the optimization breaks.
Entirely.
If you can't meet it, then it breaks. And you can't, like, then it tells you it's infeasible. And then you have to.
Even though that's a logical conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, if your constraints are too strict, like your emissions constraint is too strict, then
There's no modest.
yeah, exactly. That's possible. Then it just tells you it's infeasible.
I'm trying to understand this hypothesis.
But yeah, I mean, then you can either change the constraint or conclude how you're doing it doesn't work or whatever. But like, yeah, it's possible that you get infeasible.
Policy wise, you feel like your goal was set though, you should set.
Well, yeah, hopefully
Like
it's
5 years.
Yeah,
Incremental.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully the goal would be set in a way that you can meet it somehow.
Okay,
Otherwise,
let's regroup.
I mean, that's almost.
And why don't we actually start over this side? What do you guys have?
For our constraints or for our?
Yeah, just yeah. Why don't we talk about decision variables first? So, what things would you actually modify? So, okay, remind me when you're in your objective function, were you guys minimizing
Carbon emissions.
carbon emissions? And so, what decision variables would you be using to help you do that?
So we kind of work from the constraints back
Sure.
to the variables.
Okay.
But one of the things that we wrote down was like you might want to limit your operations and maintenance costs.
Okay.
That could be specific to a plant. Whereas like if you're looking at a regional investment, you might want your capital, the sum of all your capital investments in a region to be lower than your budget that you allocated at the state level, for example.
Okay. So those all sound like cost-based as opposed to emissions-based.
Yes.
So in a framework where you're minimizing cost, I think that makes a lot of sense.
But for emissions, the only ones that we came up with that would apply directly to emissions would be energy generation and energy efficiency of
Mhm.
whatever technology you're applying to.
Yep. So then, if I had something like an energy generation decision variable and an efficiency variable, you would want the efficiency to be as high as possible, and you want the energy generation piece to be as low as possible to reduce emissions.
So for the energy efficiency, we have an inequality, like it cannot be lower than a single cycle engine, for example, like for this technology.
Okay.
And then for energy generation, it has to be less than or equal to the capacity.
Yeah, so that's like a physics-based one. That makes sense, right? Because your power plant can actually produce more energy than
But we would need more
it's.
time to come up with a policy type of.
Yeah. Well, so the only thing I would maybe be careful here is that so that any energy generation, I presume, would have. So this is the accounting identity part. Would have an emissions associated with it, right? And so if I'm producing electricity from like a coal plant or a natural gas plant or a solar plant, there would be some emissions affiliated with that. And so if you are trying to minimize the total emissions, theoretically, I would say don't produce any energy at all, right? So how would we avoid that?
Another inequality that has to do with energy efficiency and generation.
Okay. What specifically would you want to make sure that you're actually providing some
For
energy?
example, your energy generation cannot be lower than last year's, for example.
Okay.
Although that would not be a good one, but that's like the.
Well, so you say it's not a good one, but why is that?
Well, you don't want to use energy, like you don't want to increase your use of energy over time. You kind of want to
Yeah,
lower it
okay.
if you want to. You want to optimize how you use it.
Makes sense. So I'm gonna push you just a little bit more. So I can get rid of emissions by not producing energy, but we don't think that's necessarily a good idea. Why?
Repeat that again?
So I can get rid of all emissions by stopping the production of all energy,
Yeah.
right? I can say no one gets any more gasoline, no one gets any more electricity or anything like that, right? And that would solve my
Decarbonization problem.
yeah, but it would create other problems. So
You would be living in a fictitious country like that. Does not exist.
okay, and so I guess how might you prevent that from happening, but still trying to get this like emissions thing going? So it wouldn't. So this is outside of the objective function. This would be some kind of constraint, right?
Yeah.
And so you probably want to make a constraint that lets people still use energy, right? So you have to probably satisfy some amount of demand.
Yeah, like a minimum and maximum threshold of.
Yeah, exactly. Right, and so if you had a constraint that basically said generation has to meet some amount of demand, then what ends up happening is that to reduce the emissions, you're gonna look towards the least. You're gonna look for the things that decarbonize the most in the objective function. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Cool. Okay. How about
So, we were also talking about the decarbonization.
Okay.
So, the policy constraints that, so we first go with the physics constraint.
Sure.
The physics constraint is that, because we're mostly talking about power generation, and one key issue is that many power plants are kind of already there and using like very high polluting kind of technology, so it will be costly to retrofit them. So that will be a constraint.
Uh-oh. Here we go again.
Yeah, and so although it's technically a money, like in the short term, it's a business constraint.
Okay.
And the policy constraint outlets, your people. We're talking about the policy constraints.
Yeah, because many countries that they have limitation in their natural source. Some of the country use the coal to generate power, which is generate a lot of pollution. But
Mhm.
this certain country only have tons of those source. It is expensive for them to import